We are blessed again to have Michael Santo willing to take his time to share the latest updates on the Colorado's Healthy Families and Workplace Act latest rendition and latest announcement. Since our last webinar a couple weeks ago, there's been some updates and changes, and we want to make sure that you're up to date with those because there were some changes that hit almost immediately, like within a couple of days of the last webinar. So thank you, Michael. We sure appreciate your partnership in this, and thanks on behalf of all of our clients, because I know they and I know many of you are not our clients, but just partners in the community. So, Michael, I'm going to get out of the way and thank you for your time and ask you to proceed.
Great, thanks, John. Thanks, and thanks, Manon, who's really been doing a lot in putting this together. She has been invaluable, including I think about 4 seconds before you all got on, teaching me how to share the screen properly. So that worked very well. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. What happened is that we held the last talk, and we were like, "This is where things are," and then this is where things change. So we are going to go over a lot of changes today. We, of course, you know, to understand the changes, we have to understand where we are and how we got here. So we are going to go over that as well. What I was telling Manning yesterday is please feel free to ask questions. I found after the last talk that I got a couple calls, and I told people during those calls about the law that, wow, this was a great question. I wish you had brought it up during. So please don't hesitate with questions. This law continues to confound. I was doing a talk for a group yesterday and had a thought and was like, that may not be as clear as I wanted it to be in the law. So there's also other things that we're going to discuss today. So just a lot of information continues to come out with this act, and in particular since we all met before. So you've seen the COVID-19. Here's where we are. Sorry, John, did I interrupt you?
Yeah, no, Michael, I interrupted you. So if you guys have questions, and I'm sure you will, please put them in through the chat feature. And I was remiss. Manon really puts all these together for us and for Michael, and big thanks to her. But put them in through the chat feature, and we'll try to aggregate those and answer as many as we can. So thank you.
Yep, and I know Manon's got a couple teed up already. So, excuse me, let's get started. As we've talked about before, the Colorado Healthy Families and Workplaces Act, which all the cool kids, I guess, are calling HFLA, was passed in the shortened Colorado legislative session of 2020, signed by the governor in July of 2020. There's, to a large extent, we've been under certain provisions of this law since July of 2020. Those are now gone and passed, so we're not going to focus on those today. But it was basically, we were required to comply with a federal law based on the state law. So that's how we got here. This act does mirror the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. I see here, I just noticed, I didn't mean to say the only difference. I disagree, it's the only difference. This is much broader than the FCRA. It handles the payments differently. So what it should say is here is to the extent that you weren't covered by the FFCRA, unless you're the federal government, you're covered by this or will eventually be, you're at least covered by part of it right now. You will eventually be covered by all of it. Most of you were probably covered by it all right now. So what is the law? Well, the law is that starting on January 1, 2021, so all of 6 days ago, those employers with 16 or more employees had to start providing paid sick leave or allowing their employees to accrue paid sick leave starting January 1, 2021. If you have 15 or under, you don't have to comply with that part of the law. keep in mind, and this will go through in more detail, but there are two aspects of healthy families. There's one that we'll refer to as sick leave, healthy family sick leave, and there's one that we'll spend the most of our time today, healthy families public emergency. That is a critical issue because I'll jump ahead. If you're under 16 employees and you think, whew, I don't have to worry for a year, this doesn't really matter for me, I'll just go off and do other things while Michael talks. You are not covered under the sick leave portion of healthy families, but you are covered under the public emergency portion of healthy families. So even if you have 15 or under employees, you still have to do everything under public emergency, principally give your employees 80 hours of paid leave on January 1. We'll get into public emergency in a second, but for right now, let's focus on the sick leave portion of healthy families.
And Michael, we already have a question about that sick leave. It's from Jennifer, and she asks, are overtime hours included in the accrual? And I know I've seen this question several times before.
Great question, Jennifer. Let me skip ahead, and then we'll go back. I promise I'm not gonna, you're thinking, hey, whoa, don't go anywhere. I'm gonna cheat and say, well, use my favorite attorney answer, it depends. The Department of Labor has broken this down into two separate groups. You got your non-exempt group, those who are hourly or those who don't perform certain duties. And you got your exempt group, those who are salaried and perform sufficient number of duties. That distinction is a talk for another day. But with respect to non-exempt employees, it is all hours worked. That means, that means, and it's from the first day of employment is what it says here. That means if an employee works 60 hours in a week, they've accrued 2 hours of sick leave for the under healthy family sick leave. So non-exempt employees accrue hours on all hours worked, not on all hours paid. So for example, if you gave your employees off January 1st, but paid them for the holiday, which this year was Friday, let's just say, even though it wasn't applicable then, but let's pretend, they worked 40 hours Monday through Thursday, got paid for the 8 hours on Fridays for a total of 48 hours of compensation. That would not be an hour worked, so you wouldn't have to pay for those 8 hours. You would only have to accrue, you would only have to accrue leave for the 40 hours that were actually worked. So it's all hours, regular, part-time, full-time, casual, PRN, whatever they are, if they're working, they're accruing hours. Exempt employees, the law and the regulations that the Department of Labor, or the notices that the Department of Labor has published, have made clear that overtime exempt employees can accrue, or an organization can treat it, that the employee works 40 hours in a work week. Doesn't matter if the employee works 40, 400, if the organization identifies that it's 40 hours, that's what it's accrued based on for exempt employees. Had a group yesterday ask me, well, we have a standard 38-hour schedule. Okay, then you could do it based upon that. You could do it based upon the 38 for exempt employees. Non-exempt employees, doesn't matter what your work schedule is, it only matters what they work. But exempt employees, you can treat as their normal schedule. Don't forget that in addition to an accrual, you can provide the hours to both sets of employees based upon just provided as a lump sum. So you don't have to do it as an accrual. Okay, so starting January 1, like we started talking about, we have to provide employees sick leave for the following purposes. And these are very broad. frequently heard of this as COVID leave. This part has not as much to do with COVID, although certainly it could, but it really focuses on just the sick leave. And so an employee's mental or physical illness, need for diagnosis or treatment. Keep track of this, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. If an employee is caring for a sick family member, as that's defined as anyone who's related to them by blood, marriage, civil union, anyone who they stand in local parentis with, which means that person may not have been their parent, but they acted as their parent when they were growing up, or if your employee is standing in that capacity for a child now, they would get the time. But then the key provision in here, or a person for whom the employee is responsible for providing or arranging health or safety related care. A person for whom the employee is responsible. So that if your employee's got a neighbor down the block that they provide care for, that employee would be able to take off time for that neighbor down the block if that neighbor is having health issues. And we'll talk about the public health emergency. It's that broad as well. So remember, it may be someone who they're responsible for providing care for as well. It's not just those immediate family. It's a very broad definition of family. Next question. This is a little different than maybe traditional sick leave, but if the employee is a victim of domestic violence or to assist a family member, again, broad definition, that would be covered by the sick leave portion as well. And in instances where the public health official has closed the place of business, that would be another basis for the sick leave. So those are the basis for the sick leave. Those four, keep those handy. They're very, generally discussed in the Department of Labor's poster. So if you want, I certainly encourage you to identify those bases for leaves in the policy.
Okay, Michael, we have a few questions about that 48 hours, that paid sick and safe time leave. So one question from Gus is, how is proof determined from a neighbor? So referring back to documentation that can be requested, what could you ask your employee to provide?
It's a really good question in terms of how much documentation. We, as we'll talk about in a little bit, don't really have a lot of basis to request documentation with respect to the need for leave. We'll talk about that. There's a different treatment if it's sick leave or public health emergency. Those documentation and the reasonableness of the documentation really looks to the need for leave, not the relation. The relation is more difficult. Certainly, in fact, the Act doesn't mention anything about how to establish that documentation. I haven't seen anything in the notice with respect to such documentation. You could certainly ask employees, how have they provided that leave in the past? Ask them to provide that documentation, maybe a note from the person. Could be a lot of different ways we can do it. Right now, the notices and the law just simply identifies it, doesn't really give us any instructions on how to do that. A lot of instructions on how to get a medical certification from the employee, but not much on the family member issue.
Okay, and then does an employee need to request, like, if you have multiple PTO programs, do they need to tell you which one that they're requesting time through?
Yeah,
or do you automatically to one?
Yeah, I'm going to cheat and use my favorite attorney answer of it depends. I would certainly encourage organizations to get a basis from the employee every time they're requesting leave. The reason for that is we have various different banks that we're going to be using. Also, depending on whether or not you separate out healthy families from your PTO policy, which some organizations are doing, you'll want to keep track of the leave because not only is there an accrual limit, which we're about to talk about, but there is also a usage limit. So even if an employee, let's say, you put it under your PTO policy, the employee can accrue up to 150 hours, you can still limit an employee's use of healthy families reasons under that your PTO policy up to 48. So when an employee is requesting time off, I would not do the great time off. I would always ask the follow-up question for the documentation purposes of why are you requesting the leave? You're also going to want to know if it's under the public health emergency section, because that one trumps everything. If it's a public health emergency leave, it's got to come out of there first. So it's not, the department in a weird, and I'm not going to go into their decision on this, but in a weird way, pulled some parts of the FMLA in their notices. I wouldn't have done that if I were them. That's what they did. I'd be concerned that they would look at the FMLA for that guidance. And the FMLA is doesn't put much responsibility on employees to identify those reasons. So they want employers checking in with employees as to that. So I would look to do that in these leaves, this leave as well.
Okay, and then someone is asking about seasonal employees, where they fall in this. And my understanding is that this 48 hours is paid sick and safe time. It's every employee in Colorado.
Every employee in Colorado. It doesn't, season, part-time, full-time, whatever you may be, doesn't matter. Now, seasonal is an issue when you look at, are you covered by the 16? Are you currently under sick leave? For example, if you currently have 10 employees, but when summer hits, you go up to 30. So a narrow reading or literal reading of the law would seem to say you're covered immediately when you get to 16 or more. The department has chosen not to take that approach. Their approach is to use the FMLA, and that means you have to have 16 or more employees for 20 or more work weeks. So some employers who drop below 16 and then go above 16, they may end up not being covered this year because they may not have 16 or more employees for 20 or more work weeks. So what the law says is they will accrue, including seasonal, regular, full-time, part-time, PRN, anything, will accrue 1 hour of paid sick leave for every 30 hours worked, up to 48 hours. You're not required to do that, but as an organization, because technically if an employee works 70 hours, if an employee works 2,080 hours in a year, they'll accrue about 70 hours. You can allow the employee to keep accruing beyond 48, but you're not required under the law to do that. They can accrue one for 30, and then when they hit 48, zip, that's the end of the accrual. Can't cut it off before 48. It has to be 48 and above.
Hey, Michael, this has been a common question here. We had a question in from one of our clients that asked. He already provides 48 hours of sick leave annually or a vacation annually. As long as they accrue at the required rate, can his current vacation cover him for the 48 hours of required sick leave?
Give me 2 slides and we'll do that issue in full.
Okay.
So I want to just finish this one quick point, but yeah, that is the key question on so many aspects of this.
Right.
So once the employees accrued it, let's say they accrue 70, we do have the ability in the law and under the notices from the Department of Labor to roll that back to 48, or you can simply stop it at 48. The interesting question in the law that just came up yesterday as I was reading it was, if you roll an employee, if you allow the employee to keep their 48, an employee come December 31st of 2021 has 48 hours, and they haven't accrued for a couple of months because that's where you capped it, does the employee start accruing leave on January 1, 2022? Because now we're into a new year and an employees can accrue up to 48 hours in that new year. I'm very hopeful someone from the Department of Labor is listening to this talk and addresses that issue before next year. So we'll figure that out eventually, but it is a question of whether or not they can start accruing even though they may be at that 48-hour cap. As we've talked about before, you as an employer may elect to front load the full annual amount. Of course, if you haven't done that now, it's maybe a little late because we're now on January 7th. This we talked about before, how our hours accrued. It's accrued for non-exempt employees, every hour worked. Exempt employees can be every hour worked if you want, but can also be accrued on an assumption of a specified number of hours worked. Going to John's question, and it's not really entitled this in the notices, but I call it a rose by any other name. This is a little small, but in the end, what the law and the notices identify is that if an employer has a policy that meets the requirements of the Healthy Families Workplace Act sick leave, we're going to leave public emergency to the side for a sec, but if it meets the requirements of Healthy Family sick leave through another policy, the employer is not required to give more leave than that. Now, the way they said it is a little not quite as clear as that. What they talk about is that other policy, and PTO policy, consolidated annual leave policy, whatever you want to call it, is that it must meet the amount of hours with sufficient pay to satisfy the work requirements. But here's the key provision, and this is where it can get a little tricky. For all the same purposes covered by the HFLA and applicable rules, for all the applicable rules. So that means if you want to use your PTO policy to cover HFLA and your accrual is sufficient, that may be, but you've got to start that accrual on the first day of employment. Some employers will say, well, we don't accrue for 90 days, but by the end of the year, they'll have 48 hours. Nope, not sufficient. Under HFLA, you have to start accruing the first day. So if you want that PTO policy to address HFLA too, you've got to have employees start accruing it on the first day. Even if they are going to wind up with 48 at the end of the year, got to start accruing it from the beginning. Similarly, organizations will often say, well, they accrue in the first 90, but they can't use it. You know, under HFLA, the moment it's accrued, it can be used. Keep track of that. Those of you, some organizations have a lot of paid leave. I worked with a group that had, for example, gives 10 hours of leave a month, which means that unless an employee works 300 hours in a month, that 10 hours is going to cover the accrual part. But I was working with the employer and said, don't forget, just because you accrue it on a monthly basis doesn't mean the employee can't use it during the month before it's actually on the books. So for example, if the employee works 120 hours in the first 2 weeks, they've got 4 hours accrued HFLA sick leave in their bank. Now, you may not actually put it on the books until the first of the month, next month, but they've got the ability to use that because they've worked 120 hours. So don't deny employees and say, no, sorry, it actually hasn't shown up on the books yet. Nope, it's technically on the books, even though it's not on the books. So that's another thing if you want your PTO policy to cover HFLA. Not only have to make sure you're doing 1 for 30 for the moment employment, they've got to be able to use it. They've got to be, the law identifies that we are supposed to provide employees the reasons for leave. We recommend doing that in the policy. So that would mean your PTO policy needs to address all those reasons for leave. Additionally, you also have the ability to, or the law has a lot of retaliation language in it. And their poster that they came out with has that retaliation language in it. So perhaps your PTO policy, if you want it to cover HIPAA, needs to have the retaliation language in it. Most of us don't have retaliation language in our PTO policy, but something to at least, if you're not going to put it in there, at least have a reference to the poster in your policy, and then attach the Department of Labor's poster to your handbook. So that way that retaliation information is provided to the employees in the handbook. Again, to be safe, you want to make sure that all requirements under HIFLA, sick leave, are in your PTO policy. And then the big one that people need to kind of figure out is most PTO policies say we will pay upon termination. Are we going to pay HIFLA required leave? That would be something you'd want in as well. How are you going to treat the accrued HIFLA? Are you going to treat it as 50-50? Are you going to treat it as 48 hours? Are you going to pay HIFLA sick leave upon termination? That you'll definitely want to do that, because if you're saying, no, we just put it under our vacation policy. Okay, well, your vacation policy identifies you pay it upon termination. Well, not HIFLA. HIFLA doesn't require me to pay upon termination. You're right, it doesn't. But if your policy says you do pay accrued leave upon termination, and it's not clear that you don't pay HIFLA, maybe an employee has a claim. Not something you want to take to, we have a case before the Colorado Supreme Court right now on a vacation pay issue just like that. So you want to be very clear in your policies on how that's going to work. On a side note, very quick side note, I don't know this with any certainty. I haven't heard any rumors about it, but because there are two cases, one at the Colorado Supreme Court, one at the Colorado Court of Appeals, that's requesting to go to the Supreme Court on the paid vacation issue and how it's paid upon termination, I expect our Colorado legislature to address that issue in the upcoming session. So keep an eye on that. It may change how we're all paying paid leave upon termination.
Hey, Michael.
Yeah.
So our response at Auto Paychecks to all of our clients on how should we manage this is we recommend that they create a new sick leave policy that is separate from vacation or PTO, that contains the language specifically for this regulation, so they're not trying to meld two different things. Yeah. Because I think, as you've discussed, there's a lot of legal language around this, and I think there's going to be some litigation associated to it. And we want to have a policy that we can point at and say, this matches the state policy. That's what we're doing. When you take sick leave under this, for these reasons, it comes out of this bucket. No confusion. I think that is a smart way to do it. Would you concur? It's
definitely the more straightforward, John. There's no question about it. Having a separate HIFLA policy makes it easy to know where all the banks are coming out of, makes it easy to know what you're paying, what you're not, what you have to provide and what you're not. And it does make it streamlines things. It does make it easier. I just know a lot of organizations are, I'll ask people, so how are you handling HIFLA? And a lot of people say, we're not worried about it because we already accrue 1 for 30. I'd come up with a policy that identifies how that's all going to work, the Mushkin policy. It's certainly easier, more straightforward to keep them separate, but I do know a lot of organizations, and it is lawful. It just gets wonky because some of the language just does not work well in a PTO policy. It's really weird to have a big retaliation section.
Yeah, in most cases, you're going to pay it out on termination. So
yeah. Then you got to figure out how you're going to do that, what the law is going to permit in the upcoming year, what the law may not permit. The two court of appeal, or the two appellate cases in Colorado concern vacation policies. Well, then the question becomes, is vacation policy different than PTO? It's a big mess. So this is for that reason, that is why we've encouraged to keep them separate. It just makes things more streamlined. I think This next year for smaller employers, maybe we'll see, I think, more and more push it together, simply because smaller employers, 48 hours is a lot of leave all of a sudden. What did I say here? Oh, yes, we've talked about that. We can, as part of this, and this is what you'll want to do as well in your policy, no matter if you separate it out, put them together, identify what increments the person can use paid leave. The law and the regulations identify that it's hourly increments. Here's one of the big changes under HIFWA, which is we cannot request any documentation, or only may require reasonable documentation, it says, until the employee has missed 4 or more consecutive days. So if an employee starts sneaking out of work every other Friday when it's really nice out or when we get powder, that employee may not request any documentation for the leave. Now, if you see the employee on Facebook, there may be skiing, there may be some other issues in terms of lying, but at least from the perspective of documentation, a lot of us have policies that say when you've missed 2 days or 3 days, we expect documentation. If it's under HIFWA, you can't do that. Now, some of you may say, well, we're covered by FMLA, and FMLA may kick in before that. For example, if there's an overnight stay in a hospital, the next day, we can request documentation. If you do, I would make it clear it's for purposes of FMLA, not for HIFWA. And so you would approve HIFWA leave immediately and then work on your FMLA leave. What is that reasonable documentation? It's pretty low in terms of the documentation. If the employee receives services from a provider, a document indicating a qualifying purpose HIFWA qualifying purpose will suffice. It's a very low, but if they can't do it, they can provide their own writing that the leave was for a HIFWA leave, which seems a really low requirement to me when we look at reasonable documentation, even when the employee's been gone 4 more days. For a leave with safety reasons, for example, domestic violence leave, the same rules apply as above, except that you also may request legal documentation. We may not require that the document be signed by any particular doctor or physician, nor may be required in any format. And of course, we may not require an employee to disclose details about the health. Here's what an interesting thing that came out when the department was discussing reasonable documentation is that they said that the information must be treated as confidential and not in the personnel document, not disclosed to others. So for that reason, we have almost a HIPAA-like compliance, for those of you who aren't in the healthcare industry, almost like a HIPAA-type compliance with respect to these medical records, according to the Department of Labor. So a big obligation, make sure we're keeping these separate and apart from personnel files, lock and key, somewhere where employees do not have access. Documentation cannot be required to take the leave. As we said, it's got to be 4 or more days, but can be required as soon as they are returning. Here's a weird one. The DLL, the Colorado Department of Labor, set up this rule that if an employer determines that the documentation is insufficient, the employer must notify the employee within 7 days of receiving the documentation. So if you don't have that, sorry, you look over the screen. If you look at the documentation, you're like, well, this is in crayon from a doctor. You have to get back to the employee within 7 days. If you don't do it within 7 days, you can't request anymore. And then they've got 7 days to cure the issues. Key part is we are not required to pay out unused accrued sick leave under HIFWA. So make sure that our policies identify that. And this is what I say here, well, unless that's required under the handbook, we've talked about before, they can go up to 48 hours. Oh, an odd one is particularly for those of you who use seasonal employees or who have an employee return. If the employee comes back within 6 months, they've got to be reinstated. Their HIFWA previously accrued HIFWA sick leave must be reinstated. Okay, any questions on HIFWA before we get into public emergency?
There's a lot of questions about how those 80 hours and 48 hours are going to work together. Are you going to cover that, or should I ask some questions now?
Let's get in let me finish the 80 and then we'll hit that in.
Perfect, thank you.
So hold on to those for a couple seconds. Additionally, in addition to sick leave, we also have public emergency leave. This is not just COVID, it's any public emergency. If you recall, last summer, a lot of counties were under a public health emergency or public emergency due to the fires. So it's not just public health emergency, it's not just COVID, it does expand out. And what it says is that basically employees are entitled to accrue, or employees must have leave provided to them so that the employee is, how do I want to say it? That the leave is made available to the employee to take at least 80 hours for full-time employees, less for anyone who works under 40 during a work week. You can then do it based upon their normal schedule, normal work hours. But those who work 40 or more hours, they have to have made available to them up to 80 hours of leave. What I say here is their info sheet number 6 made clear that, hey, even if you're under 16 employees, you still have to comply with this. First question, and this was asked in our last, or was addressed in our last talk, but first question, are we currently under the declaration of a public health emergency? The short answer is yes. The longer answer is the federal government, the Secretary from the Health and Human Services, placed us under a public emergency back in April and has basically continued that on. Initially, the Department of Labor from Colorado took the approach that no, we will not be under a public health emergency come January 1 because it has to be declared on or after January 1st. So the Secretary of Health and Human Services declaration back on October 2nd, even though that's going to extend into January, doesn't matter at all. They ended up reversing that announcement, and on December 22nd, they announced, whoops, sorry, we are under a public health emergency, and so all employees are entitled to have available for full-time 80 hours of leave under the public health emergency. So this means that all employees must supplement each employee's accrued sick leave balance to ensure that the employee has 80 hours of leave. As it says here, for employees who normally work 40 or more, that's 80 hours. For employees who work normally less than 40, you can figure it out based upon a 14-day period, whichever calculation is better. So you got your HIFWA here, HIFWA sick leave here, and now every employee under HIFWA public emergency has 80 hours of leave available to them. They don't accrue so much as it is available to them. What the law said, and notice I'm going to make a distinction in a second, the law said that we can use paid leave as an offset to giving them the 80. So if an employee's got 50 hours of paid leave, well, we only need to give 30 under public health emergency leave, under HIFWA's public health emergency. Or if they have 20 hours of paid leave and it meets, and you're using, for example, your PTO to cover HIFWA, then if they've got 20 hours built, you only need to give them 60. You can't just start grabbing all your leave policies. If you want to use as an offset under the law, you got to make sure that those leave policies comply with HIFWA. Starting at the start, 1 for 30, get to use right away, blah, blah, blah. That's what the law said. The regulations came back and said something else, is that in the interpretive notice, it identified that during a public health emergency, employers must immediately provide each employee additional paid leave, supplementing whatever HIFWA leave the employee accrued before the public health emergency, with enough that they equal 80. So it appears by this notice from the Department of Labor, because we went under a public health emergency at midnight, January 1, most of us don't have any HIFWA sick leave built up. So the department seems to be taking the very narrow approach that only HIFWA sick leave can count as an offset to the public emergency leave. Now, there's certainly an argument that if you put your HIFWA sick leave under your PTO leave, that can count as an offset. But if you've got it separate, that won't count as an offset. The way also we get a lot of questions of, okay, if we give 80 on January 1 and the employee starts to accrue, let's say they accrue 10 hours during January, can I then subtract 10 hours from public emergency? Because now the combined HIFWA sick leave and public emergency would be 90, 10 plus 80, instead of 80, or instead of 70, which would be 10 plus 70 equals 80. So can I take away an hour of HIFWA public emergency as the employee accrues HIFWA sick leave? By this regulation, it's not regulation, it's a notice. By this notice, it certainly does not look like we can pull out as the employee accrues. So it's basically at this point, the employee's got 80. If you had previous HIFWA leave accrued, maybe that could have provided an offset, but if you didn't, because they got it on January 1, they got 80. If your policies identified it was under a policy, you may have the ability to declare that.
So Michael, clarification on that. So January 1, all employees in Colorado have 80 hours in their bucket. Bang, okay?
Bang.
So they shouldn't also accrue HIFWA, because
HIFWA
48 of that 80 hours could be considered HIFWA and their bank's already full.
No. So they, in the notices, what they've been doing is saying, we've got HIFWA by itself. Employee had no HIFWA sick leave. HIFWA comes in on January 1st. We're under a public health emergency. They get, boom, their 80 hours. They work 30 hours in that first work week. They get another HIFWA sick leave hours. So now they got 1 hour of sick leave, 80 hours of HIFWA public emergency leave. Then they work 30 more hours. They pick up another HIFWA sick leave, and they still got their 80 hours of public health emergency. The HIFWA sick leave continues to accrue up to 48, if that's where you said it, even if they've got their 80 under the public health emergency. That is stated.
It's additive.
It's added. I think I even have somewhere in here. Yes, on this slide, they also continue earning accrued HIFWA leave at their regular, it should say regular rate, not the regulation rate. Whoops, sorry, typo. At their regular rate up to 48 hours. So they continue to accrue HIFWA sick leave, even if they've got their full bucket of 80.
So we have.
Go ahead, sorry, Madam.
Sorry, we have a question. So if a company decides to front load the 48 hours and the 80, does that mean they have to, I mean, that's what, 128 hours?
If the company,
if they don't use any of the 80, do they return down to the 48 at the end of the public health emergency?
If the company decided to, there's a couple things with that. If the company decided to front load the 48, and presumably you decided this before December 31st, if they decided to front the 48, you technically would only owe 32 under public health emergency leave, because you can do it as an offset, because you, in the world's longest second, quickly front loaded them 48 and then said, whoops, they only need 32 to get to the 80. Now, if you're deciding on January 7th oh, we want to do that full accrual thing. I think that may be a little tricky. Not what I'd recommend. I'd also be careful in, flip-flopping your policies, because once you decide to accrue 48 as a dump, you're accruing 48 as a dump. So when public health emergency goes away, and hopefully it goes away soon, that employee, you can't say, okay, now we're going back to accrual. I think that would be a little wonky under the law. So keep in mind that while it may benefit you now to simply drop the 48 in, or would have benefited you on December 31st, it may not benefit you going forward. So something to keep in mind. And to follow up on Mannon's point, once the public health emergency is over plus 4 weeks, so public health emergency goes away on June 1st, hopefully it goes away sooner, but let's say it's June 1st, 4 weeks after that, we can take out all the whatever's left of the 80. So that leave is not forever. It's not paid upon termination. And as it says here, it will, it all goes away 4 weeks after the public health emergency ends. The leaves are a lot like the FFCRA, but they're much broader. And it goes in, it's self-isolating due to a positive diagnosis, seeking medical treatment, suffering from a pre-existing condition that would make the employee more susceptible, where a public health health official has deemed it to be unsafe for the employee to come to work. It's also if the individual is experiencing symptoms under that are like COVID, that's identified in the regulations and law. So it's in the under FFCRA, if an employee was having symptoms and didn't have a positive test and wasn't getting one, there was an argument we didn't have to give the employee paid FFCRA leave. That's not true under public health emergency leave under Colorado. If the employee is experiencing COVID symptoms, there's a really strong argument that the employee, as they say here, where a public health official is deemed to be unsafe or displaying symptoms of the illness. That means it's a very broader definition of the reasons for leave. So keep that in mind. If it's anything related to COVID, if it's anything related to the virus, the pandemic, it will fall under HIFL public emergency. And let me go back. And the first place it has to come from is HIFL public emergency. It can't come from HIFLA accrued sick leave. It's got to come from public health emergency. So if you didn't dump the 48 and the employee's accrued 5 hours, and now the employee has a COVID issue, they get to use their 80, and then arguably that 5 is still around. Don't forget, family member is very broad, very, very, very broad. And it talks about providing and arranging care. Employees retain their accrued leave during a public health emergency. They also continue earning accrued leave, even though they have it, and they may use a supplemental leave. If the reason falls under both, you first have to use public health emergency, not HIFLA paid sick. Unlike paid sick leave, which frankly had very low requirements, under HIFLA public emergency, yeah.
Michael, let me interrupt you. We're getting a lot of questions from folks who have pretty high carryovers in PTO and sick leave, asking if that will cover them for the 80 hours. And I think you were quite, I'm just going to repeat for you, this emergency sick leave is additional to whatever other policies you have.
It could be in addition. So the law, if you set up a HIFLA policy as of December 31st that said, we're doing one PTO bucket, and here are all the reasons, and it identifies public health emergency. You did your poster, and it's going to be a one-stop shop. It's going to be public, it's going to be HIFWA sick leave, it's going to be HIFWA public emergency, it's going to be all those leaves. As a carryover, hey, employee, you've got 100 hours of PTO leave, so you really don't get public emergency because that you've already got 100 hours built up. There's a strong argument in the law that that's, and the notices, that that's permissible because you are allowed to offset those, your HIFWA, the amount you make available under HIFWA, a public emergency, the amount you make available under HIFWA public emergency based upon how many hours the employee already has in the bank, but it had to be there as of December 31st. Keep track though of that requirement. Now let's say you got 2 employees. You got Mike over here. He's the good employee. He doesn't get sick very often, rarely takes vacation. He's got 150 hours built up of leave. And so we put it under one big PTO policy, and we tell Mike, hey, that didn't work out for you. You're not getting any additional leave because you already had that much. Now you got Michael over here. He uses every second of the leave the moment he gets it. He's got 0 in his PTO. He's got 0 in his sick leave. He's got 0 everywhere. Because the moment he gets it, suddenly he's sick. The moment he gets it, suddenly he needs a vacation day. That person gets 80 hours of leave. You could see how maybe Mike would not be really happy with how the organization is treating Michael. That they may look at it like, what? So if I took more leave, I'd be getting I'd get the full leave. But because I'm here, because I show up, because I don't miss for every cold, sniffle, and flu, because I don't take a lot of vacation, I don't get this public health emergency, but that person who takes off every second, they get it. Keep track of how that may, it's one of those, yes, you may be able to do it, but is that really, the message we want to send? Something to keep in mind just for the 80 hours of public health emergency, which hopefully will be going away in the next few months as immunizations become more of a thing.
All right, Michael, we're kind of running up on our hours here, and we've gotten a lot of questions about how the PHEL and the FFCRA are going to work together, and I wanted to make sure I get some of these questions asked.
The nice thing with the FFCRA is it is gone. It is gone as a requirement under the law. We are permitted, if we go way ahead, the FFCRA is still around in terms of if you want to provide FFCRA leave, you still can, and you still can get the tax credits for it through March 31st, but it is no longer a requirement either under state law, we took it out December 31st, or under federal law, they took it out as well on December 31st. So
I have a good question about, so does 2/3 pay rate still apply to the 80 hours for the third reason to take when you're caring for children at home, as it did under the FFCRA?
No,
or you always paid your full rate under the PHEL?
You're always paid your full rate under HIFWA public emergency. Okay. That 2/3 thing, that is gone. That's, well, I mean, I guess if you give the employee 80 hours of HIFWA public emergency and then give the employee 80 hours of FFCRA leave, which you're still permitted to do, you could use the 2/3 rate and get your tax benefits from it. But you could put FFCRA leave before public health emergency leave.
Okay. And then if a business is required to shut down for a public health emergency, would the company be required to use the HFWA time and the 80 hours?
It's actually, and I thought I had it in my requirement, that once, if the business is completely shut down, then there is no requirements for the leave. I thought I had it in there. I'll have to go back, but I was pretty sure that's in there for that. If the business ends up getting completely shut down.
Okay. And then we've had a lot of questions about the overlap of the FFCRA and the
Healthy
PHEL in
families?
regards. So say somebody used, just keep it simple, 40 hours of COVID leave in 2020. Then they get 80 hours of PHEL in 2021 now. That employee can be paid full, they can leave a full 80 hours this year, but tax credits can only be used for 40 hours in 2021 because they used 40 hours of tax credits in 2020.
Okay, so let's talk about there are a couple of questions in there. There's not much overlap between the FFCRA and HIFWA because FFCRA ended December 31st, HIFWA started January 1st, so no overlap there. A lot of organizations will say, hey, you mean if I gave an employee 80 hours under FFCRA the last 2 work weeks of the year, and they now want 2 work weeks at the beginning of the year, I got to give them 80 more hours? Yes, they are completely separate leaves. One does not offset the other. For tax purposes, if you gave 40 hours of leave in 2020, when you file your 2020 tax return, or whenever you do, I'm not an accountant, but whenever you do that whole thing, you will get the tax credit for the 40 of the FFCRA leave, or the 80 or the 56, whatever you gave to that employee. You will be able to use it then. There is no tax credit for the 80 under healthy families. Nada. We didn't get any benefit for giving it. It is strictly a out of our pocket arrangement. Someone told me yesterday when I was talking about this, you're no fun. And I'm just quoting the law, so apologies. If I didn't say this, unlike to the extent that there was a notice requirement under sick leave, there is no notice under public health. You can get no documentation, nada. There's nothing that can be requested under public health emergency. Any other questions, Bannon?
Oh, yes. Okay, so here's one that I've heard before, and I hate this question. If you require an employee to quarantine for 14 days after they've taken a personal vacation out of the country, are you required to pay them for COVID? So they just voluntarily exposed themselves to COVID, and they took 40 hours of paid leave for the week, and then they come back and you're requiring them to quarantine. Do you have to pay them an additional 80 hours of paid leave since they're required to quarantine?
Well, they would not have received that leave under the FFCRA. And as we go through the reasons for the public health emergency leave,
they've got no symptoms, they're not sick, Michael.
Yeah. But there's a discussion there's a reference to self-isolating due to a positive diagnosis. That's a positive diagnosis. Experiencing symptoms, they're not experiencing any symptoms. So seeking medical treatment or preventative care, nope, they're just sitting at home. There's an argument a strong argument, I think, if you require someone who doesn't have a diagnosis, who is experiencing no symptoms, remember, there's a lot of symptoms with this, so it's got to be no symptoms. There's an argument that would not be covered under HIFWA public emergency. Strong argument.
Okay.
I would lean toward.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
You're good.
Another question is, and I've seen this a couple times, how is this 80 hours of leave handled for part-time employees? Do they still get full 80 hours?
No, they get the amount that they normally work or are scheduled to work, whichever is greater, in a 2 work week pay period. If you go back to the slide there, at least an amount of time an employee is scheduled to work in a 14-day period, maximum, 40-hour maximum, or the amount of time the employee actually works on average in a 40-day work period, whichever is greater. That's how much part-time employees have. They've set it at 40, which is, I think, a really high bar. So those employees who traditionally maybe only work 38 or 37, they can get less leave. 40 and above, exempt employees, you're going to be all in on the 40. But anyone who works a little bit less can fall under that part-time designation for purposes of public health emergency leave under HIFLA. Obviously, for sick leave HIFLA, it doesn't matter because it's 1 for 30. Manning's running through all the questions. There's a notice, as Manning runs through the questions, there's a notice, get online, make sure. Someone told me my link wasn't working. I hope it works, but the CDLE has made it available. We do have to post the poster. And I would recommend that organizations, I've been actually including it in the handbooks that we work with organizations on, and display the poster. And so to do that, I just think that's, make sure the employee's aware.
And Michael, a thought on that also, we have so many remote workers right now that emailing labor posters out is a good idea.
It is. It is. Email and attach them in the handbooks, which they sign.
So we are, we exceeded our hour here,
We
Michael.
did, sorry.
No, we're good. So I wanted to say thank you so much for your time.
Welcome.
A couple of things to remind folks of is later today, this recording will be posted on the autopaychecks.com blog under today's date. Manning will do that later on today. And then a reminder to our clients, you have a lot of leaves to track now and to be able to prove that they have been used or not used. If you have not yet requested that we set those leaves up in your instance of our system, please do so emailing to info@autopaychecks. Otherwise, we're not setting them up automatically, we're setting them up on request because everybody's handling them differently. I think that's all we have from our end. Again, thank you so much, man, and thank you for all your work in getting this set up. You're a rock star.
Thank you, Manning.
Thank you for all the people that have attended.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, so much for just helping everyone and our clients through all of this crazy.
Glad to know this is a constantly
On
developing.
behalf of everybody, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, take care.